Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
He carved the turkey like he was some kind of war hero returning from battle, shoulders back, chest puffed out like he'd built this whole damn house with his bare hands, and we were all just lucky to be sitting at his table. The knife glinted under the kitchen light as it sliced through the meat with the kind of aggression that made you look twice. I sat at the far end, beside the window, watching the steam rise off the mashed potatoes while pretending not to feel the pressure building in my chest. He didn't look at me when he said it, of course he didn't. That would have meant acknowledging that what he was about to say wasn't just a joke or some truth bomb for the sake of entertainment. No, he dropped it like a casual afterthought while passing the plate of stuffing to my mom. "You're too old to be living off us, Mia." Just like that. Knife down. Fork in hand. Delivered with a smirk and a long sip from his beer. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the sweet potatoes like they were the only thing holding me to the floor. Because if I looked up, if I met his eyes, I wasn't sure what would come out of my mouth. Maybe a scream. Maybe a truth that would unravel every fragile lie this family had wrapped around themselves for the last 3 years. So I stayed quiet. I chewed slowly. I nodded when Aunt Lynn asked about my remote job. I smiled at my cousin's new engagement ring. I even offered to help with dishes. But inside, something cracked. And once something like that cracks, it doesn't go back to normal. It starts leaking. It had been 3 years since I moved back in. 3 long years since my dad blew out his back on a roofing job and had to quit work. 3 years since I gave up my apartment, packed up my life, and moved back into my childhood bedroom, thinking it would be temporary. That's what everyone says, right? Just until things stabilize. At first, it made sense. Dad was healing, Mom was trying to keep the house running, and the bills were stacking up faster than they could count them. So I stepped in. I paid the electric, the water, the gas, then the mortgage when I realized how close they were to losing the house. At first, they thanked me. At first, they were grateful. And then, slowly, like a rot under the floorboards, it became silent. Expected. Unmentioned. Like it never happened. So when he said it, when he called me a leech at his own Thanksgiving table, I didn't answer because I wasn't surprised. I'd been watching it build. The little digs. The passive-aggressive remarks. The way he introduced me to neighbors as between jobs even though I was making more money than he ever did in his prime. He needed to believe that he was still the man of the house. That his daughter had fallen and needed saving. But I never fell. I jumped right into the fire he built and left unattended. The next morning, while he was outside pretending to fix the shed he's been ignoring for 10 years, I made a single call. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Just one short, administrative conversation. I told them to remove my name from the utility accounts. All of them. And when the lady on the line asked if I was sure, I said yes with the kind of calm that only comes when you've been pushed so far that the cliff doesn't scare you anymore. By mid-afternoon, the first email came in confirmation that the electric account had been successfully transferred back to the primary homeowner. That was him, not me. And it would be his overdue balance now. His final notice. His lights. His dark. I didn't say a word during lunch. He sat across from me, bragging about how he was going to get things back in shape around here and maybe finally refinance the garage. I nodded, biting into my sandwich, counting down the hours until sunset. It was around 5:30 when it happened. The TV clicked off mid-sentence. The overhead light in the kitchen flickered once, then died. There was a half-second pause, like the whole house took a breath, and then came the inevitable yelling. "Diane, what the hell's going on with the power?" My mom came running out of the laundry room, holding a damp towel. "I don't know, Wayne. I was in the middle of a wash cycle." I sat on the living room couch, pretending to scroll my phone. Calm. Collected. A performance worthy of an Emmy. He started flipping switches, opening the fuse box, cursing under his breath. When nothing worked, he picked up the landline and barked at the electric company's automated system for 10 minutes before slamming the phone back down. "They say it's a billing issue," he shouted, like someone had committed a personal betrayal. "They're wrong," I said, eyes still on my screen. "They're just doing their job." That's when he turned to me. Really looked at me. For the first time in weeks, maybe months. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. "Did you do something?" he asked. But it wasn't really a question. It was an accusation dipped in disbelief. Like he couldn't wrap his head around the fact that I had any real power in this house. I didn't respond. I just locked eyes with him for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner and gave a half shrug. That shrug said everything I couldn't say with words. It said, yes, I did something. Because you made me invisible and now I'm reminding you who's been holding this whole damn place together. By the time the sun went down, the house was cloaked in darkness. No lights. No TV. No Wi-Fi. The fridge made one last groan before falling silent. My mom lit a candle and placed it in the middle of the dining table like we were reenacting some kind of historical drama. My dad sat in his recliner, arms crossed, jaw set, refusing to speak. He looked smaller without the lights. Dimmer. Like the truth had finally stripped him down to size. But me? I felt taller than I had in years. And that was just the beginning. When the house went dark, there was no dramatic explosion, no sparks flying from the outlets, no thunderclap to mark the shift in power, just a slow, creeping hush that fell over everything like fog rolling in off the lake. One moment, the hum of appliances filled the background, microwave clock blinking, fridge motor buzzing, the faint rattle of the central heat kicking on, and the next, it was all gone, like someone had flipped a switch inside the bones of the house. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that settles when something's broken, but no one wants to admit it yet. The kind that makes people look around like the world suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. At first, I pretended not to notice. I was in the kitchen, sipping on tea that had gone lukewarm while I scrolled through job listings I didn't need. My dad was sitting in his recliner, flipping between channels like a man on a mission, when the television screen cut to black. I heard the remote hit the floor, the creak of leather as he shifted in his seat, and then the heavy silence filled with just enough confusion to trigger panic. "Diane," he called out, his voice already sharp with that authority he liked to throw around when things didn't go his way. "What the hell happened to the damn TV?" I didn't move. My mom came into the room with a confused look, holding a basket of unfolded towels. She glanced around like the darkness was something she could shoo away with a broom. "Maybe a breaker tripped," she said softly, her eyes already darting to me, as if some part of her knew. I kept my face blank and my posture relaxed, like someone completely unaffected by whatever household inconvenience had just occurred. It wasn't an act of cruelty, it was survival. Because if I so much as flinched, they'd see it. They'd sense it. And then the game would be up before it ever had the chance to begin. My father stormed down to the basement like a soldier heading into battle, flashlight in one hand, jaw clenched so tight you could hear it grind. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he disappeared into the dark below, muttering to himself about the goddamn electric company and lazy-ass technicians who don't know their head from their ass. I heard the unmistakable click of switches, the sound of metal tapping against metal, followed by a long string of curses that grew louder the longer nothing happened. He came back up sweating, angrier than before, and launched into a full-blown rant about infrastructure failure and modern dependence on digital crap, pacing back and forth like a man betrayed by the very wires under his roof. I watched it all with the kind of quiet satisfaction that I'd once considered impossible. For years, I'd swallowed every snide remark, every eye roll, every time he talked about my life like it was a failed project he never got around to finishing. I'd paid the bills in silence, kept the roof steady while he complained about its color, and carried the burden of responsibility like a backpack full of bricks, all because I thought that maybe, one day, he'd look up and finally see me. Not as a failed daughter or a burden or a placeholder, but as a person. As a woman who showed up when it mattered. But he didn't. He never did. And so now, I wasn't angry, I was done. The temperature dropped quickly once the heat stopped cycling. The house, built in the early 80s and never properly insulated, started to breathe out warmth and inhale the sharp cold of the Midwestern evening air. My mom wrapped herself in a fleece blanket and lit a few tea candles, placing them around the living room like we were about to hold some kind of seance. My dad refused the blanket I offered. He stood near the window, arms crossed, scanning the street to see if the neighbors still had power. When he saw the soft, golden light shining from the Steinbergs' windows across the cul-de-sac, his face twisted into something ugly, like betrayal mixed with disbelief. "They're fine," he muttered. "So why the hell are we the only ones in the dark?" I didn't answer him. I just looked up from my phone and said, "You could call the utility company, you know. Maybe there's a mistake on the account." I said it slow and even, keeping my tone helpful neutral. But I saw the way his eyes narrowed, the way his lip curled at the edge like he smelled something rotten in the air. "Don't talk down to me," he said, the words flat and heavy. "I know how to make a damn phone call." He spent 20 minutes yelling at an automated system before he finally got someone on the line. I could hear the whole conversation from the hallway, how the rep told him the account had been transferred, how there were past due balances, how the power had been shut off due to non-payment. I could almost hear the moment he realized the name on the account wasn't his anymore. That the safety net he'd been resting on was gone. That the scaffolding of control he'd built around himself had been pulled away, and there was no one left to hold him up. When he hung up, he didn't say anything. He just sat down hard in his chair, staring at the dark TV like it had personally betrayed him. My mom sat across from him, hands trembling around a mug of cold coffee, her eyes darting between us like a referee who'd missed the beginning of the fight and didn't know how to stop it. She didn't ask what happened. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she'd known for longer than she let on but was too afraid to say it out loud. Sometimes silence is a form of loyalty. Sometimes it's just fear in a prettier dress. That night, he pulled out the old camping lantern from the garage, muttering that a man's got to have backup when the system fails. He grilled hot dogs in the backyard on the rusty propane burner he'd used once during the ice storm a decade ago. I watched from the kitchen window as he stood in the flickering flame, bundled in his old Carhartt jacket, gripping the tongs like they were weapons. He looked less like a father and more like a man trying to survive a war no one else was fighting. As the night dragged on and the cold crept deeper into the walls, I found myself sitting in the hallway, my back against the door, listening to my parents argue in the next room. Not screaming, just low, cutting whispers. My name was mentioned more than once, and though I couldn't catch every word, I caught enough. "She didn't deserve that. She should have said something. You should have said thank you." Then silence. When my mom came out an hour later, she didn't look at me. She just said, "Try to sleep. Tomorrow's a new day." But I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, wrapped in 3 layers of blankets, listening to the wind knock against the window panes and wondering how many more days it would take before the truth stopped being something we tiptoed around and started being something we actually faced. And I already knew tomorrow wouldn't bring clarity. It would bring confrontation. Because in houses like this, the truth doesn't come clean. It claws its way out. By morning, the house had begun to feel like a tomb, silent, unmoving, with an unnatural stillness pressing against the walls like the breath of something unspoken, something dense and waiting. The cold had crept in during the night, sliding under doors and wrapping around the baseboards, crawling into the sheets and soaking into the bones of the place, until every floorboard groaned with the weight of it. I'd always known the house was drafty. I just hadn't realized how much warmth I'd been buying on everyone's behalf, how my quiet, invisible contributions had been the only thing keeping the winter out, the lights on, and the illusion of stability intact. But now, stripped of that illusion, everything felt brittle, as though it might crack under the slightest pressure. And I could tell, from the way my father's voice rang hollow when he barked at the microwave that no longer beeped back, that the realization was starting to reach him too. He didn't say much that morning, which in itself was a kind of statement. He made a show of bundling up in his old work jacket, pacing the living room with a hammer he wasn't actually using, occasionally tapping on walls or peering out the windows like some shadowy general surveying his post, looking for signs of enemy advancement. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward me, his expression caught somewhere between suspicion and resentment, like he wanted to say something but hadn't yet decided which version of the story he was going to tell. The one where he was the victim of a technical mishap, or the one where his grown daughter, who he'd accused of freeloading, had decided to stop paying for the very roof over his head. Mom tried to keep the peace, as always, moving quietly through the house with a cup of instant coffee and a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes, offering reheated soup for breakfast and lighting another candle as if the flicker of it could distract from the dead silence of the refrigerator or the fact that the air inside the house now matched the chill outside it. She didn't ask any questions, and I didn't volunteer any answers, but I could feel the weight of her glances, curious, uncertain, and maybe just a little ashamed. She wasn't stupid. She'd always been more perceptive than she let on, and now that the consequences of our family's denial had wrapped themselves around us like frost, I could see it in her shoulders, in the way she hunched as she walked, like she was carrying something she hadn't signed up for. Later that afternoon, my dad attempted to revive the old generator, an ancient thing that had been gathering dust in the garage since the Y2K scare. He dragged it out with the kind of stubborn determination that only men like him possess, refusing to acknowledge the rusted cables or the fact that the thing hadn't run since I was a teenager. I offered to help, not out of kindness, but because I wanted to see him try to accept assistance he didn't control. Predictably, he waved me off with a dismissive grunt, muttering about how he didn't need supervision. He spent the better part of an hour cursing at the thing, choking on fumes, yanking the starter cord until his arm ached, and when he finally gave up, drenched in sweat and failure, he kicked it hard enough to bruise his own foot. I said nothing. I just watched, arms crossed, knowing that the silence would bite deeper than any "I told you so" ever could. By sundown, the temperature inside the house had dipped below 60, and the tension had begun to settle into every room like dust on old furniture. We didn't eat dinner together. My mom quietly made sandwiches, no toaster, no stove, and passed them out like we were refugees of our own stubbornness. My dad took his to the garage and sat in the dark like a man who had lost a battle and didn't yet know how to retreat. I sat in the den, wrapped in a thick blanket, scrolling through an endless list of rental listings in neighborhoods I didn't want to live in, because even now, part of me wasn't ready to leave this place behind. It wasn't about the house. It never was. It was about what it meant to stay, and what it meant to walk away, and whether either choice made me weak. It was around 9 when my mother knocked gently on my door, 3 soft taps, barely audible over the sound of the wind pressing against the windows. She didn't wait for me to invite her in. She just stepped inside, holding something in her hand that she kept partially hidden behind her sweater. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, those same eyes that used to scan my forehead for fevers or search my face for lies, looked older than I remembered. She sat on the edge of my bed and placed the object between us without a word. It was a checkbook. Her checkbook. Not the joint account she shared with my dad, but the one she kept for herself, the one I hadn't seen since before college. I stared at it, unsure what I was supposed to do with the gesture. She folded her hands in her lap and looked down at her knees. "He never told me," she said softly, the words thick with something heavy, regret, maybe, or disbelief. "I didn't know you were paying for everything. The mortgage. The bills." I thought, she trailed off, but the silence finished the sentence for her. She thought I'd been freeloading. Just like he said. Just like he wanted her to believe. I didn't reply right away. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, like something had lodged itself there, anger, sadness, some mixture of both. After a long pause, I finally said, "It's fine. I didn't do it for credit." She looked up at me then, and for a moment, I saw the young version of her, the woman who used to braid my hair and bake birthday cakes from scratch, the woman who once whispered that I could do anything I wanted if I just kept going. But this version of her was tired. She took my hand and placed the checkbook in it gently, as if she were handing over something sacred. "It's not fine," she whispered. And it hasn't been for a long time. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cold in the house wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional, structural, built into the foundation. My father hadn't spoken to me since the failed generator attempt, and now I didn't expect him to. We had crossed some invisible line, one that neither of us had the tools to fix. But I couldn't stop thinking about the look on my mother's face, the way she'd handed over that checkbook like it was both an apology and a peace offering. It wasn't money she was giving me. It was acknowledgment. A quiet admission that I hadn't imagined the weight I'd been carrying. And still, even after all that, I found myself wondering what would happen next. Because if this was war, and it was, in all the quiet ways that families fight, then the next move would be his. And something in me knew, deep down, that my father wasn't going to surrender. Not without trying to take something with him. By the time the weekend rolled around, the house had fully surrendered to the cold, each room growing heavier with frost-laced breath and brittle silences that echoed louder than any argument ever could. The refrigerator, long since silenced, now stood as little more than an oversized cabinet of rotting food and wasted effort, the once bright vegetables turning gray at the edges and the milk transforming into a slow, living science experiment that no one had the energy or pride to address. My mother, still moving on autopilot, tried to maintain some shadow of a routine, lighting candles before sunset as if the flicker of a flame could fight back the looming absence of electricity, and wrapping herself in 2 sweaters, one of which still had a "World's Best Mom" patch I had ironed on in the 6th grade. She didn't ask if I was okay anymore, and I didn't offer reassurances, because at that point, we had all come to understand that things had shifted so deeply out of place that pleasantries had become not only useless but almost insulting. My father, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the darkness, not because it empowered him, but because it gave him a new enemy, a new shape to throw his frustration at, something external he could blame without admitting any failure within himself. Every morning he rose earlier, as if beating the sun made him master of something again, and paced the perimeter of the house like a man defending a castle no one wanted to invade. He dug through drawers, slammed cabinets, disconnected and reconnected wires from the breaker box in a frenzy of electrical denial, convinced that if he just jiggled the right connection, the lights would spring back to life and restore the illusion of control he was so desperate to reclaim. And through it all, he barely acknowledged my presence, which, ironically, only reinforced the invisible weight I had always carried, the quiet labor of being unseen but necessary. Of being the scaffolding no one respects until it's gone and the whole damn house starts to fall apart. But it wasn't until Saturday morning, when I decided to go down to the basement to retrieve a space heater I'd tucked away years ago, that I stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see, something that added a jagged edge to the quiet resentment already burning under my skin. Tucked behind the old furnace, wedged between a broken dehumidifier and a box of holiday lights from another era, I found a weathered envelope, brittle and stained along one edge, the kind of envelope someone hides when they're afraid of it being found. Inside were 24 folded bills, 20s and 50s, not new, but crisp enough to know they hadn't been touched in a while. I counted quickly, my fingers trembling with the kind of anger that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. $2,000. Not a fortune, but not nothing either. Enough to cover the utility bills for 3, maybe 4 months, had he chosen to contribute. At first, I stood frozen, staring at the money like it might rewrite everything I knew. But it didn't. It made everything sharper, more defined. This wasn't about hardship. It wasn't about him being unable to help. It was about choice, his choice to pretend he was still the provider, the patriarch, the victim, while I quietly hemorrhaged income to keep this place from collapsing under its own rusted weight. He had been working under the table. A few handyman gigs here and there, enough to keep a little stash hidden, enough to preserve his pride at the cost of everyone else's sanity. And in that moment, standing there in the half-darkness of the basement with the cold seeping up through the concrete floor, I understood something that I think I'd always suspected. My father didn't see this family as a unit. He saw it as a kingdom. And he would rather let it freeze to death than admit someone else had kept the throne warm in his absence. I didn't confront him right away. I put the money back, carefully, exactly as I found it, and climbed the stairs with the space heater in my hand and a storm growing behind my teeth. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet avoidance, my mom trying to cook canned soup over a sterno flame, my dad outside again with his hammer and broken pride, and me, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the wall and wondering how far someone had to fall before they realized they were never standing on solid ground in the first place. but by nightfall, I couldn't hold it in anymore. He came in through the back door, stomping snow from his boots, face red from the wind, and muttered something about the neighbors' damn Christmas lights being a fire hazard. I waited until he was unzipping his jacket, then dropped the question like a stone between us. "Why didn't you pay the bills, Dad? You had the money." He froze, fingers still on the zipper, his eyes narrowing not in confusion, but in recognition. He knew. He knew exactly what I meant. And still, he said nothing, just stared at me like I had crossed a line that only he was allowed to draw. When the silence became unbearable, he finally spoke, voice low, almost measured. "I didn't ask you to pay anything. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just a sentence loaded with deflection and ego, meant to absolve him of every unspoken contract we had all been living under." I laughed. It came out harsh, involuntary, and it bounced off the walls like glass shattering. "You're right," I said. "You didn't ask. You just expected. You built this fantasy where you're still the man holding it all together, while I've been bleeding behind the scenes to keep the lights on so you can keep pretending none of this is real." He stepped closer then, not menacing, but full of that slow-brewing anger I'd seen in him before, an anger that didn't explode, but sank its claws in and waited. "You think you're better than me now," he said, his tone mocking, almost amused. "Because you made some payments? You're a damn martyr all of a sudden." My heart was pounding, but I didn't flinch. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, I don't think I'm better. I think I'm tired. I'm tired of saving people who pretend I don't exist. I'm tired of being the backup generator no one thanks until the house goes black." My mother came into the room then, drawn by the noise, her face pale and drawn, eyes flickering between us like she was watching the last sparks of something sacred going up in smoke. She didn't say anything, and I didn't need her to, because in that moment, I wasn't looking for a witness. I wasn't trying to win. I was drawing a line that should have been drawn years ago, and I knew, with terrifying clarity, that there was no walking it back. That night, I packed a bag. Not all my things, just the essentials. Laptop. Chargers. A few sweaters. The blanket my mom knitted me in college. I didn't say I was leaving for good, and they didn't ask. I don't think any of us were ready to define what this was yet. But when I zipped that bag and walked it down the stairs, every step felt like a chapter closing, slow and deliberate. Before I walked out the door, I turned to my father one last time. He was sitting in the dark, arms folded, face blank. "You had the power," I said, "but you let it go out. On purpose." And then I walked into the cold night, the snow falling in thick, wet clumps, melting into the shoulders of my coat, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt the cold without resenting it. Because at least it was honest. I didn't drive far that night, not because I had nowhere to go, but because part of me wasn't ready to put too much distance between myself and the walls I'd grown up inside, even if they now felt like they were closing in more than sheltering. I parked just outside of town, in a cheap motel off the main road with flickering neon signage and an ice machine that hadn't worked in years, and sat behind the wheel for what felt like forever, watching snow gather on the windshield as the engine hummed quietly beneath my feet, like a second heartbeat, steady, present, but not quite enough to calm the storm churning inside me. I had spent the better part of 3 years playing the role of silent provider, the one who kept everything functional, the one who made sure the pipes didn't freeze and the mortgage stayed out of default, and yet, with one public insult over a plate of turkey and gravy, my father had tried to reduce me to a parasite in my own childhood home, as if all the sacrifices I had made were some form of invisible charity no one had asked for. The motel room was exactly what I needed, nothing more than a bed, a heater that rattled like an old man clearing his throat, and enough stillness to hear myself think without the constant drone of expectation. For the first time in weeks, I slept without waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of my father's heavy boots pacing the hallway, or the low hum of my mother's whispered worry. I didn't dream, or if I did, I don't remember. All I know is that I opened my eyes the next morning and felt like something had shifted, not resolved, not healed, but shifted, like a gear slipping into place after grinding for too long. I spent the day in silence, scrolling through listings for apartments I wasn't yet sure I could afford, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup, and watching the weather update on my phone while the snow outside the window thickened into a blanket that would surely take hours to clear. The idea of going back wasn't appealing, but it wasn't out of the question either, and that fact alone unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the seething, sharp-edged way I had been the night I left, but there was something colder settling in behind my ribs, something that felt a lot like finality. Like the slow realization that no apology would ever unburn what had already turned to ash. It was just after dusk, the sky bruising into shades of gray and blue, when my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in weeks, my brother Kyle, who hadn't been home for any of the chaos, who hadn't lifted a finger to help with the bills or even call to ask how things were going, but who somehow always had perfect timing when it came to appearing just after the dust settled. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering, my thumb hovering over the button like I was holding a lit match. When I finally picked up, I didn't bother saying hello, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was tight, clipped, like he was trying not to sound rattled. "You should probably come back," he said, and for a split second, I thought maybe this was the moment. Maybe someone had finally told him the truth. But then he added, "Dad's in the hospital. Hypothermia." They found him half-conscious in the garage. The silence that followed wasn't shocked, it was empty. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already grieved the part of him I thought might someday say thank you. I drove back through slush-covered streets with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, not out of panic, but because my body needed something to hold on to, something physical and firm, to counterbalance the weight pressing down on my chest. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, and the automatic doors sighed as they opened, like even the building itself was too tired for this kind of drama. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in my car with the engine off, watching my own breath fog the windows while my thoughts swirled like smoke in a room with no vents. I pictured him lying there under thin white blankets, his skin cold, his pride broken but not gone, and I wondered if he'd blame me, if he'd sit up the second he had the strength and tell the nurses that his daughter left him to rot. But more than that, I wondered if he'd even remember that I had once saved him, not once, but repeatedly, in small and thankless ways that didn't leave bruises, but still hurt just as much. And in that moment, I understood something that made my stomach twist. He wouldn't remember. He'd rewrite the story, like he always did, turning himself into the tragic figure and everyone else into extras in his long, miserable play. I didn't walk through the double doors. I didn't sign the visitor sheet or ask for his room number. I stayed in the car, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was finally drawing a line between what I could forgive and what I couldn't, between being a good daughter and being a whole person. My phone buzzed again, Kyle, this time texting instead of calling. Just 4 words, "He's asking for you." And still I didn't move. Because the truth is, sometimes asking for someone isn't about reconciliation. It's about control. It's about dragging them back into a narrative they've finally fought their way out of, and I wasn't ready to be written back into his version of events just so he could feel absolved. If he wanted forgiveness, he'd have to find it in the cold, sterile stillness of that hospital bed, because I had nothing left to give that didn't come at the cost of myself. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, the snow started again, soft and relentless, covering everything in a clean white sheet that almost made the world look new. And yet, under all that quiet, under the gentle hush of winter trying to smooth things over, the truth remained ugly and unfinished and burning beneath the surface. And maybe that's how it ends. Not with closure. Not with a reunion. Not with a final apology or a tearful embrace under fluorescent lights. But with a daughter in a car, parked just outside the place where the man who raised her finally found out what it means to lose power, for real this time, and realized that when the lights go out, sometimes the person you always expected to flip the switch back on just isn't coming anymore. Not because she doesn't love you, but because she finally loves herself more.